Okay, welcome back everyone. Now that we've learned more about what mental health really is, we're going to deep dive into some of the factors that affect our mental health. As we now know, each of us may be anywhere on the mental health spectrum at any point of time. Whether or not we have a diagnosable mental health condition, every one of us may find ourselves in a state of poor mental well-being when we feel overwhelmed. This could be from change, from uncertainty. Perhaps, there may be some big transitions going on that may be hard to adjust to, or events like the pandemic, which affected all of us and was out of our control. It could be triggered by grief from losing a loved one or an important relationship. So, beyond things happening around us, our own physical state and perhaps how our bodies are programmed can also play a role in the developmental of mental health conditions. In this segment, we'll be exploring the various risk factors through the lens of the biopsychosocial model. Now, the biopsychosocial model stands for the biological, psychological, and social model of mental health. And it actually shows how dynamic and overlapping some of the mental health factors can be, and how our state of mind can be influenced by many different factors. It can vary from person to person, and each individual facing mental health difficulties can have a different story when it comes to their own experiences through the biological, psychological, and social factors. As we talk about these three aspects of mental health, you must understand that we've discussed regarding assumptions about how dynamic human beings are and how complex we are as individuals, and how these areas are likely to overlap, and not only overlap but also interact with one another. When we talk about the biological aspect of mental health, it is often driven by genetics and also by a person's physical health condition. Regarding genetic factors, this means that individuals who have perhaps family members who have specific mental health conditions, they are at a higher risk of experiencing it themselves, even though it's not absolute. As a medical professional, often when someone comes to me with a history of depression, schizophrenia, or even autism, I will also ask them if there's anyone else in the family who has struggled with the same condition. It does guide me in terms of how I intend to treat the individual as well. When we look at the physical health of an individual, we also look at the array of medical illnesses that could be related to mental health symptoms. For example, there may be an individual out there who has a thyroid condition which is uncontrolled. If a person is low in the thyroid hormone or experiencing what we call a hypothyroid state, they may actually present with depression in the first instance. And as soon as you detect there is actually an issue with the thyroid hormone, you can focus on treating that particular physical condition. And when that is addressed, interestingly, the depression will be resolved. So there are many biological factors that can indeed influence someone's state of mental health, even though it is actually a medical illness per se. Now we go on to the psychological factors. When it comes to the psychological aspect, we're looking at how an individual approaches and overcomes their own challenges. This could be very much related to their own childhood experiences, their own internal temperament as an individual, as well as their own internal personality, and also to some extent their own self-esteem and their own confidence in themselves, where they park their attitudes, their beliefs, their values over certain issues. These factors are actually very important because they contribute to how individuals navigate their relationships, how they form meaningful connections, and how they cope with conflicts or even loss. Psychological factors of the individual are driven from within and often shaped by how they grew up and affect how they now view themselves and the challenges they face out there in the world. So the third and final one is actually the social factors. How I tend to describe this is if we put ourselves in a position where it's stressful enough, there will be a breaking point for each and every one of us. We can never fully expect how our environment will impact us. For example, with the same absolute job scope, someone may struggle in work settings that are unfriendly, filled with bullying, and perhaps use fear to drive employees, but thrive in a more nurturing environment where their strengths are magnified and they feel valued. The social environment can change everything for the individual's state of mind. The environment also matters at a younger age. One's family circumstances, the nurturing environment that children have, or the lack of it, what they learn about the nature of parental responsibilities, as well as perhaps culture and the socio-economic status that they come from. When it comes to social factors, this can come in the form of a student's school environment and peer-to-peer relationships that they have established. These are also things within the environment which can impact a person's state of mental health and self-esteem. I think it's important to talk about the complexities when it comes to biological, psychological, and social factors that contribute to a person's mental health. You see that a patient's psychiatric history, family history, developmental history, and even educational history can sometimes play a part. Sometimes when we talk about education beyond the academic ability, it can also reflect an individual's resilience against new stresses. And when we look at the psychological aspects, the ability of the individual to be able to overcome these future stresses could be seen also in their self-esteem, their ability to cope with their own emotions, as well as how their thoughts and beliefs shaped and are shaped by the way they navigate the world around them. When we look at the social front, obviously illness or injury can be both debilitating, but yet also a form of resilience. For example, depending on the factors in their environment, a young individual, say with type 1 diabetes, may either skew towards an independent and disciplined life, or on the other end, be at risk of, say, depression because they've been in a negative environment that puts them down. So illness or injury can potentially be both a protective factor to mental illness or a predisposing factor to mental illness. And it really depends on the individual's environment as a whole. A life cycle transition that is often highlighted, and this is also backed by research, as one of the most catastrophic things that can happen to any one individual is actually the loss of a spouse or a life partner. Especially when you know that you've gone through thick and thin with this particular person. Other significant life changes also bring up an incredible sense of grief and loss, and can bring about mental health challenges as well. Whether it's the experience of divorce, whether it's the loss of a child, or changes to one's living conditions, or even losing a job. The last column hints at the impact of an exposure to stressful experiences early in life. Researchers call these adverse childhood experiences, and this can include highly stressful events such as losing a parent, growing up with abuse, or even violence in homes. A 2020 study in Singapore concluded that 64% of adults have gone through at least one adverse childhood experience. You would have heard, that there have been some success stories where individuals who have experienced such difficult events in their upbringing have stood against the odds and gone on to build meaningful, enjoyable lives. But just the same, you would have also heard of individuals who are born into a life of difficult circumstances and then also find that because of these difficulties, they continue to experience the prolonged effects and negative circumstances to their mental health into their adulthood. Now, that is the colorful dynamic that is our mental health. it is important for us to have awareness of some of these risk factors of mental health. And really, what I've shared today is really non-exhaustive as far as the list is concerned. And again, coming back to the assumptions we talked about early on in the module, sometimes we do assume that someone with an adverse childhood circumstance can turn out poorly. But just the same, someone with an adverse childhood circumstance, with the right points and guidance along the way, can actually turn out dramatically different. And that's why we should always check our assumptions before we help someone.